Stop explaining yourself. Psychology of silence, self-improvement, emotional maturity, personal growth, boundaries. You used to explain everything, every decision, every boundary, every choice that looked slightly different from what the people around you were doing. You explained why you left. You explained why you stayed. You explained why you needed space, why you changed your mind, why you stopped showing up to things that drained you. You explained yourself to people who never once asked themselves why they needed the explanation in the first place. And one day, not dramatically, not with an announcement, you just stopped. You didn't plan it. You didn't read a book about it. Something inside you shifted, and the words that used to pour out of you in defense of your own existence simply dried up. And the strange part, the part nobody warned you about, is that the silence didn't feel cold. It felt like the first honest thing you'd done in years. If that's where you are right now, if you've gone quiet in a way that confuses the people who are used to hearing you justify yourself, this video is going to explain exactly what happened to you and why it might be the most important shift you've ever made. Before we talk about the silence, we need to talk about what came before it. Because people don't stop explaining themselves out of nowhere. They stop because they ran out of something. Not patience, not words. Something deeper than that. They ran out of willingness to perform understanding for people who were never going to meet them there. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from explaining yourself to someone who has already decided who you are. You're not having a conversation. You're filing an appeal with someone who has already signed the verdict. And the worst part isn't that they won't listen. The worst part is how long it takes you to realize that no version of the truth, no matter how clearly you say it, was ever going to change their mind. Dr. Susan David, a psychologist at Harvard Medical School, calls this emotional labor without return. It's the act of investing enormous psychological energy into being understood by someone who is not actually confused. They didn't misunderstand you. They chose a version of you that serves their narrative. And every time you explain yourself again, slower, softer, more carefully, you're not correcting a misunderstanding. You're feeding a dynamic that was never designed to give you what you need. The people who stop explaining themselves have usually spent years doing it. They didn't wake up one day and decide silence was a personality trait. They woke up one day and realized that the explanation had become more about the other person's comfort than their own clarity. They noticed that they were spending more time managing how their truth was received than actually living it. And that awareness, once it arrives, cannot be unfelt. And that's the moment the shift begins. Not loudly, not with a confrontation. Just a quiet, internal recognition that the cost of being understood by everyone is the slow erosion of being honest with yourself. There's a reason this happens at a certain stage of life and not before. And it has nothing to do with becoming cold or detached. It has everything to do with a psychological process that most people never learn to name. Leon Festinger, one of the most important social psychologists of the 20th century, introduced the concept of cognitive dissonance, the discomfort a person feels when they hold two conflicting beliefs at the same time. What most people don't realize is that cognitive dissonance doesn't just happen inside you. It shapes how other people respond to you. When you change, when you grow, set boundaries, make decisions that don't match the version of you that someone has already accepted, you create dissonance in them. And here is the part that matters. Most people don't resolve that dissonance by updating their understanding of you. They resolve it by rejecting the new information, by deciding that you've changed in a bad way, by labeling your growth as distance, your boundaries as selfishness, your silence as arrogance. And that is why explaining yourself stops working past a certain point. You're not trying to bridge a gap in understanding. You're trying to override someone's psychological defense mechanism. And defense mechanisms don't respond to logic. They respond to threat. The more clearly you explain yourself, the more threatening the truth becomes, because accepting it means they'd have to restructure their entire perception of you. Most people would rather keep the old version of you alive in their head than do that work. This is what emotionally intelligent people eventually figure out, not from a textbook, but from lived experience. The silence isn't a withdrawal. It's a recognition that not every relationship is a place where truth can land safely. From the outside, it looks like you've gotten colder. People notice. They say things like, "You've changed. You don't talk to me like you used to. You're distant." And part of you, the part that was trained to manage everyone else's emotional experience before your own, almost flinches, almost goes back, almost opens the door and starts explaining again. But there's a deeper part of you now that holds steady. And what that part knows, what it took you years of exhaustion and over-explaining and emotional bankruptcy to learn, is that the discomfort other people feel when you stop performing for them is not your responsibility to fix. This doesn't mean you've stopped caring. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings about people who go quiet. They haven't become heartless. They've become selective. There's a difference between withholding and choosing. Withholding comes from fear. Choosing comes from clarity, and the people who've stopped explaining themselves are not hiding. They've just learned that access to your inner world is something that should be earned, not demanded. Psychologist Dr. Henry Cloud, who spent decades studying boundaries, once said something that stopped a lot of people in their tracks. He said that boundaries are not walls. They are the edges of what you will allow, and allowing things has nothing to do with how much you love someone. It has to do with how much you're willing to lose yourself to prove that love. And here's something else that nobody talks about. The transition period, the space between explaining everything and explaining nothing, is brutal, because your nervous system was wired for the old pattern. For years, maybe decades, your body learned that safety meant being understood. That silence meant danger. That if someone was upset with you and you didn't immediately clarify, something terrible would happen. So when you first stop explaining, your body panics. You feel guilty. You feel selfish. You lie awake at night replaying conversations, drafting explanations you'll never send, feeling the phantom weight of words you chose not to say. That's not weakness. That's withdrawal. You're detoxing from a pattern that was never healthy, and your nervous system doesn't know the difference between discomfort and danger yet. But it learns. Slowly, one unexplained decision at a time, one boundary held in silence at a time, one morning where you wake up and realize that the person you didn't explain yourself to last night didn't actually need the explanation, and you didn't need to give it. The people who stop explaining themselves have usually lost themselves once already. They know what it feels like, and they've quietly decided that no relationship, no approval, no amount of being understood is worth going back to that place. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because when you stop explaining yourself, some people will not take it well, and the way they respond will teach you more about them than years of conversation ever did. Some people will escalate. They'll push harder, ask more questions, frame your silence as evidence that something is wrong with you. They'll say you're being difficult, defensive, cold, immature. Some of them will try guilt. They'll remind you of everything they've done for you. They'll act hurt, not because they are, but because hurt has always been the tool that got you to open back up. And some of them, the ones who are hardest to spot, will pretend to understand. They'll nod along and say they respect your space. But what they're actually doing is waiting. Waiting for the version of you they're comfortable with to come back. Because they don't want to understand your silence. They want to survive it until it passes. This is one of the hardest truths about personal growth. The people who react the worst to your boundaries are almost always the ones who benefited the most from you having none. Dr. Ramani Durvasula, a clinical psychologist who specializes in narcissism and interpersonal dynamics, has talked extensively about how certain personality types respond to boundary setting with what she calls the narcissistic injury response. It isn't anger in the normal sense. It's a deep, unconscious panic that the person they've been extracting from has suddenly become unavailable, and because they can't name it as panic, it shows up as accusation, as punishment, as withdrawal designed to make you feel guilty for protecting yourself. If you've experienced this, if someone in your life has made you feel like setting a boundary was an act of cruelty, pay attention. Because the people who love you properly will never make your peace feel like a crime. There's a stage that comes after the silence, after the discomfort, after the people who couldn't handle it have shown you exactly who they are. And this stage is the one that nobody prepares you for, because it doesn't look the way self-improvement content usually tells you it should. You don't feel triumphant. You don't feel healed. You feel alone, in a specific, quiet, very honest way. Not lonely, not abandoned, just alone with yourself in a way that used to terrify you and now feels like the only thing that's real. And here is the paradox that only people who've walked this road understand. Being misunderstood is painful, but being misunderstood because you refuse to shrink yourself to fit inside someone else's version of you, that's a different kind of pain. That pain has something inside it that you didn't expect. It has respect, self-respect, the kind you can't fake and can't borrow from anyone else. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist who spent his entire career studying the relationship between the conscious and unconscious mind, wrote extensively about what he called individuation, the process of becoming fully yourself. Not the self your parents wanted. Not the self your friends are comfortable with. Not the self that performs well in social settings. The actual self. The one underneath all the explanations and justifications and careful editing. Jung believed that individuation is the most important psychological task of a person's life. But he also warned that it comes at a cost, because the more you become yourself, the less recognizable you become to the people who only knew the version of you that existed for their benefit. This is the quiet power of being misunderstood. It means you've stopped curating yourself for other people's comfort. And that terrifies people, not because you've done anything wrong, but because your freedom reminds them of the version of themselves they've been too afraid to become. And here is something that will sit with you long after this video ends. The people who misunderstand you the most loudly are almost always the people who understand themselves the least. Because if they had done the work, if they had sat in their own silence, faced their own discomfort, questioned their own patterns the way you've been questioning yours, they wouldn't need you to explain. They'd recognize what you're doing. They'd see it for what it is. Not distance, not rejection. Just someone finally standing in the full weight of who they are without apologizing for how much space it takes up. You're not asking anyone to like it. You're not asking for applause. You're just no longer willing to make yourself smaller so that other people don't have to confront their own discomfort. And that single decision, that one quiet, unremarkable, uncelebrated decision changes everything that comes after it. Something changes once you've lived in that silence long enough. Not overnight. Not in a way you can point to on a calendar, but gradually, like a fog lifting so slowly that you don't notice it's gone until you suddenly realize you can see. You start to notice who comes toward you without an invitation. The people who aren't drawn to the performance because there's no performance left. The people who sit with you in silence and don't rush to fill it. The people who ask how you're doing and actually wait for the answer, not the rehearsed answer, not the everything's fine answer, the real one. These people are rare, and you wouldn't have found them if you'd kept explaining yourself to everyone who demanded it. Because the noise of justification drowns out the signal of genuine connection. You were so busy being heard by the wrong people that you couldn't hear the right ones trying to reach you. You also start to notice something about yourself that surprises you. Your decisions get faster, not reckless, faster. Because when you remove the step where you mentally rehearse how everyone else will react before you make a choice, the choice becomes remarkably clear. You've been carrying the weight of other people's potential disapproval as if it were your own doubt. And once you put that down, you realize half the confusion you felt about your own life was never yours to begin with. Dr. Brené Brown, a research professor who spent over 2 decades studying vulnerability, courage, and human connection, calls this the wilderness. She describes it as the place you end up when you stop trying to belong to everything and everyone. The wilderness is uncomfortable. It's uncertain. But it's the only place where belonging to yourself is possible. And the people who stop explaining themselves are the ones who finally decided that belonging to themselves matters more than belonging to a room full of people who were only comfortable with the version of them that asked for permission. So if you're here, if you've gone quiet in a way that you can't fully explain to anyone, including yourself, let me tell you what happened to you. You grew. That's it. Not in the way that gets celebrated. Not in the way that earns applause or looks good on a timeline. You grew in the way that costs you something, in the way that makes you smaller in some people's eyes, while making you larger in your own. You stopped explaining yourself because you finally realized that the people who deserve to understand you don't need the explanation, and the people who demand it will never be satisfied by one. You didn't become cold. You became clear. You didn't shut people out. You let yourself in. For the first time, maybe. After years of leaving the door open for everyone else. And the world is not going to reward you for this. Not visibly. Not immediately. People are not going to throw you a party for learning to protect your peace. They're more likely to call you difficult. To say you've changed. To look at your silence and see absence where there is actually presence. More presence than you've ever had in your own life. But here's what I want you to hold on to. The version of you that explained and justified and softened and apologized and bent yourself into shapes that other people could accept, that version was surviving. The version of you that stood up, went quiet, and let the ones who were going to misunderstand you go ahead and misunderstand you, that version is living. There's a difference, and you already know which one you'd choose if you had to go back and do it again. You wouldn't explain. You'd just walk. And one last thing, if this video found you at the right time, if it described something that's been sitting inside you that you couldn't name until now, subscribe. There's more coming. Things that go deeper than most people are ready to talk about. Things that live in the space between who you were and who you're becoming. And if you know someone who's been going quiet lately, someone who's been pulling back in a way that worries you or confuses you, send them this, not as advice, as recognition. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to someone who's stopped explaining themselves is, I see you, and I don't need you to explain.